Today I'm going into a topic that is discussed in a lot of different forums that I see online. And this one is really, how are cards graded? What are the things that go into grading? And what are some key mistakes that people make when thinking about grading or trying to look at cards themselves? I'll put those at the end, but let me start by talking about what's being looked at when cards go to a grading company like PSA or Becket. And for the most part, it's really four things. So the first is centering. How well is the card centered uh, within the cardboard, both top to bottom and left to right? The second piece is the corners. How sharp are the corners? The third is the edges along the sides of the card. And then the fourth is really the surface area of both the front and the back. And this sounds simple, and it sounds like people can generally look at cards and get a sense, but it's really not that simple and not as consistent as one would like for the practice. So from a centering perspective, it really comes down to how well is the image aligned on the front and the back. And there's sort of this 50-50 rule that sort of the card should be sort of, which is considered perfectly centered. So for a 10, there's a very small tolerance. So 55-45, so almost exactly centered. There's a little more leeway on the back with the 75-25, but they really have to be sort of well centered. And and look, if a card is in really good shape and it's not centered well, it can really bring it down a bunch. And this is something I see a lot when people post on Facebook, wondering why their card came in at a certain number, and then you can obviously see that it's centered, let alone with a more precise tool. The second piece around the corners is around the sharpness. Are they crisp? Are they weathering or fraying? And rounded corners are really one of the quickest ways to lower a grade. I strongly suggest zooming in and magnifying glass and so on, because again, I'll see people post, and then as you zoom in on the picture, you can see there's a little bit of white showing on the corner, or maybe it's bent a little bit from putting it into a sleeve or something like that. And look at both sides of the corners. The third piece is the edges, and looking for clean and smooth edges, no dings, no cuts. I will note that a lot of the vintage cards used to be sort of printed with these giant printing presses and these machines that would cut them, and over time the machines would get dull and may have what's called a rough cut, which would kind of fray the edge a little bit. Interestingly enough, because these are from the factory, the rough cuts don't generally get the same punishment of lower grades. So something to consider, certainly when sending in vintage cards. And then the last piece is surface, and this is the one I tend to overlook early on when I first started sending my cards in, which is looking for, in the 70s, you'd always see these little print dots that would be different colors, or scratches. Sometimes you can even see vertical or horizontal lines that go across the cards. And then making sure that there's no stains, especially from the early wax packs. For those who like to break old cards, there'd be wax stains, surface indentations. I remember sending in a Bo Jackson card and not realizing that there was sort of a little indentation that I saw when I came back, but not when I first looked at it. And the reviewers really meticulously look at these with magnifying glasses and lighting in a certain way to make sure that that they find no imperfections. So I'm not going to drain this, but just to give you a sense of comparisons going across the centering from sort of a 10 to 4, this is general guidelines, but you can see the centering as you move away from sort of the 50-50 front and the 75-25 back. Very quickly it starts dropping into lower grades. Same thing with the corners. A tiny little touch under magnification makes something a 9 or an 8. And so a lot of times what people look at are the things that generally make something a 7 or a 6, but not the really small imperfections. Edges, same thing. Very making sure that they're exactly crisp, and then no scratches, no dots, anything like that from a surface area. And any one of these categories, let alone multiple, can drop it down. So as promised, here's some of the common mistakes I think people make when thinking about how cards are graded. The first one is, I see this all the time, somebody will post and say, hey, I just opened this from a pack, therefore it should be a 10 because nobody's touched it. And the problem is there's lots of cards that are off center or have dings or things like that just from how they were produced, not necessarily handled. And so that doesn't mean it's a 10 just because you got it from an open pack. The second piece is not thinking about the back of the card, which gets scrutinized just as well as the front. Third is this concept that maybe PSA is stricter on vintage because they're older, and that's not true. The vintage cards get lower grades because there's a lot more wear and tear. They weren't cared for early on, right? They were thrown in people's bicycles and shoeboxes and attics and things like that. And so, that's what leads to lower vintage scores, not because of there's sort of a stricterness. The fourth one is you see there's all sorts of kits about cleaning cards and pressing them and doing other things that might help, and that they promise all of these higher scores. I haven't seen too many successful examples of this, but they are out there, so consider it for yourself. And then the last piece is really focusing on one attribute, not thinking about all of the things in total. So like I said, somebody will look at it and say, hey, the edges look good, right? But maybe it's off center or has a mark on it or so on. So you really have to think about all of those criteria and really strictly consider each of them and how they relate to if you want to grade. And I have another video on the pros and cons of grading, but this was more to give you a sense of the kinds of things that are looked at and the kinds of things to look out for. So with that, I would ask, take a look, post some comments in there, let me know what I missed, other examples, and feel free to subscribe if you want some more content. Thanks.